Picture this. You're standing in one of the most beautiful cities in the world. The year is 1221. Around you, gardens bloom with roses and jasmine. Water flows through carefully designed channels, cooling the air on this warm spring day. Scholars debate philosophy in the shade of ancient trees. Poets recite verses in elegant courtyards. Children laugh and play in the streets, while merchants from distant lands haggle over silk, spices, and precious gems. This is Nishapur, the jewel of Persia, a city so magnificent that travelers would journey for months just to see its wonders. A place where knowledge was treasured more than gold, where the greatest minds of the Islamic world came to study and teach. But here's the thing that'll break your heart. In just a few weeks, every single person you see in this beautiful city will be dead. Every man, every woman, every child, even the dogs and cats wandering the streets won't survive what's coming. And the worst part? Most people today have never even heard about it. Let me take you back a bit further, because to understand how something this horrible could happen, you need to know about a man named Genghis Khan. Now, I know you've probably heard that name before. Maybe you think of him as some ancient warrior king, right? But here's what you need to understand. Genghis Khan wasn't just any conqueror. He was building something the world had never seen before. An empire that would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the doorstep of Europe. And he was doing it with a military machine so efficient, so terrifying, that entire kingdoms would surrender just hearing his name. The Mongols weren't like other armies. They grew up on horseback. Seriously, Mongol children learned to ride before they could walk properly. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while galloping at full speed. They could survive on almost nothing, drinking horse blood mixed with milk if they had to. They were tough in ways that would make modern special forces look soft. But it wasn't just their toughness that made them scary. It was their strategy. See, Genghis Khan had a simple rule. Surrender and you might live. Fight back and everyone dies. Not just the soldiers, everyone. He wanted the world to know that resistance was pointless, that the only smart choice was to open your gates and submit. And you know what? It worked. City after city across Central Asia heard the Mongols were coming and just gave up. Kings, emperors, sultans, they all bent the knee. Because they'd heard the stories. They knew what happened to cities that said no. But Nishapur? Nishapur was different. Too proud to bow. To understand why Nishapur made the choice it did, you've got to understand what this city meant to the Persian world. Imagine if you combined Oxford, Paris, and New York into one city. That was Nishapur. It was ancient, powerful, and incredibly wealthy. The city sat on the Silk Road, that famous trade route connecting east and west. Every day, caravans arrived carrying treasures from China, India, Arabia, and beyond. The taxes from this trade alone made Nishapur's rulers richer than most kings. But it wasn't just about money. Nishapur was a center of learning that attracted the brightest minds of the age. The famous poet Omar Khayyam was born here. You know, the guy who wrote the Rubaiyat. Mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, they all came to Nishapur to study and teach. The city's libraries held thousands of precious manuscripts. Its observatories tracked the movements of stars with incredible precision. The people of Nishapur had something that many conquered cities didn't: pride. Deep, unshakable pride in their culture, their history, their city. They looked at the Mongols and saw barbarians. Nomads who lived in felt tents and didn't even have proper cities of their own. Sure, these barbarians had conquered some places, but Nishapur had stood for nearly 2,000 years. Its walls were thick and high. Its soldiers were well trained. Its people were numerous. Why should they surrender to horse-riding savages? It's heartbreaking, really. Because that pride, that confidence, that refusal to believe they could really lose, it sealed their fate. Number. The man who would doom a city. Now, here's where our story gets personal. Because this massacre wasn't just about military strategy or empire building. It was about revenge. In 1220, a Mongol army led by a man named Tokchar approached Nishapur. Tokchar wasn't just any general, he was Genghis Khan's son-in-law, married to one of the Khan's beloved daughters. He was young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself worthy of his position. The Mongols surrounded Nishapur and demanded surrender. The city's governor looked at the Mongol forces and made a calculation. Yes, they were numerous. Yes, they were fierce. But Nishapur's walls were strong, its defenders many, its supplies ample. They could hold out. So they said no. The siege began. And for a while, things went exactly as the governor hoped. The Mongols attacked again and again and again and again. Nishapur's defenders threw them back. Arrows rained down from the walls. Boiling oil poured on anyone who got too close. The city's catapults hurled stones at the Mongol siege engines. And then, during one of these attacks, something happened that would change everything. An arrow flew from Nishapur's walls. Just one arrow among thousands shot that day. But this arrow found its mark in a way that would doom tens of thousands of people. It struck Tokchar in the chest, piercing his armor. The son-in-law of Genghis Khan fell from his horse. His men rushed to help him, but it was too late. Within hours, Tokchar was dead. Can you imagine the silence that must have fallen over the Mongol camp when they realized what had happened? Can you picture the messengers riding day and night, carrying the news back to Genghis Khan? The Khan had lost a son-in-law. His daughter had lost a husband. And according to Mongol tradition, this death demanded blood. Not just the blood of the archer who shot the arrow, not just the blood of the soldiers on the walls, the blood of an entire city. Number. The order that changed everything. When news of Tokchar's death reached Genghis Khan, sources tell us he didn't rage or shout. That wasn't his style. Instead, he became very quiet, very cold. And he gave an order that still chills historians today. Nishapur was to be erased. Not captured, not conquered, erased. Every living thing in the city was to be killed. Every building was to be destroyed. The land itself was to be plowed under and sown with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. The city that had dared to kill a member of the Khan's family would serve as the ultimate warning to the world. To carry out this sentence, Genghis Khan chose his daughter, Tokchar's widow. Her name was Alakai, though some sources call her by other names. She would have the honor of avenging her husband's death. Think about that for a second. The Khan trusted his own daughter to lead this revenge. In Mongol culture, this wasn't unusual. Mongol women could be warriors, leaders, and decision makers in ways that would shock medieval Europeans or Middle Easterners. But this was something special. This was personal. Alakai was given command of a massive army. Some sources say 100,000 men, though numbers from this period are often exaggerated. What matters is that she had enough, more than enough, and she had her father's complete authority to do whatever was necessary. The army that marched back to Nishapur in April 1221 wasn't coming to conquer, it was coming to kill. Number, the last days of normal. Inside Nishapur, life went on. Sort of. Sure, people knew the Mongols would come back. But they'd beaten them once, hadn't they? They'd killed one of the Khan's own family. That proved Nishapur could defend itself. The walls still stood strong. The warehouses still held food. The wells still provided water. The governor, a man whose name history barely remembers, sent messengers to other cities begging for help. Surely, the great Muslim cities of Persia would send armies to help defend Nishapur? Surely, they wouldn't abandon such an important city? But here's the brutal truth. Nobody came. Other cities had heard what happened when you got involved in Mongol business. They'd heard about cities that tried to help their neighbors and ended up sharing their fate. So they sent sympathetic messages. They prayed. They did nothing. Nishapur was alone. In those final days before the Mongol army arrived, I wonder what people talked about. Did mothers hold their children tighter? Did men who had argued over trivial things make peace with each other? Did young lovers promise to stay together no matter what happened? Or did they convince themselves it would be okay? That somehow they'd survive this too? The spring of 1221 was beautiful in Nishapur. The gardens were in full bloom. The weather was perfect. The kind of days that make you grateful to be alive. People had no idea they were living through the last normal days their city would ever see. Because on the horizon, dust was rising. A lot of dust. The kind of dust that only comes from thousands upon thousands of horses marching in formation, coming closer with every hour. The Mongol army had arrived. And this time, they weren't coming to lay siege. They were coming to bury Nishapur so completely that future generations would struggle to even find where it once stood. You know that feeling when you're watching a horror movie and you want to scream at the characters, "Don't go in there, turn back." That's exactly how it feels looking back at Nishapur in April 12, 21. Because everyone in that city, from the governor down to the smallest child, was about to face something they literally couldn't imagine. The Mongol army that appeared outside Nishapur's walls wasn't like the one that had come before. This was bigger, more organized, and led by someone with a very personal reason to see every brick of the city reduced to dust. Let me paint you a picture of what the people of Nishapur saw when they looked out from their walls that day. The army of vengeance. Imagine standing on those high walls, looking out across the plain. The first thing you'd notice is the dust, a massive cloud of it, rolling toward you like a storm. Then, as it gets closer, you start to see shapes in the dust. Horses. Thousands and thousands of horses, and riders in leather armor, moving in perfect formation. The Mongol army wasn't a chaotic mob. It was organized like a machine. They had units of 10, units of 100, units of 1,000. Every man knew his place. Every commander knew his orders. They moved like a single organism, responding to signals from flags and drums. But here's what really should have terrified the defenders: the siege equipment. See, people back then had this idea that nomads from the steppes were just simple horsemen. They didn't understand walls or siege warfare, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. The Mongols had conquered China. And from Chinese engineers, they'd learned everything about breaking into fortified cities. They brought massive catapults that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They had siege towers tall enough to overlook Nishapur's walls. They had battering rams with iron heads. They even had primitive firearms, tubes that shot fire and shrapnel. And they brought something else, something that still makes my skin crawl: prisoners. The Mongols had conquered several cities on their way to Nishapur, and they'd kept thousands of prisoners alive for one specific purpose: to use as human shields and forced labor during the siege. These poor souls would be driven forward to fill in moats, push siege towers, and absorb the first wave of arrows from the defenders. Imagine being on Nishapur's walls and recognizing faces in that mass of prisoners. Maybe someone from a nearby village, maybe a merchant you traded with, maybe even a relative, and knowing that if you shot your arrows, you might hit them instead of the Mongols. This was psychological warfare on a level most medieval armies never even considered. The woman who led the assault at the head of this army was Alakai, the daughter of Genghis Khan and the widow of Tokchar. And before we go any further, I need you to understand something important. This wasn't some symbolic command where a princess sat in a tent while men did the real work. Mongol women, especially royal women, were raised to be tough. They learned to ride, to shoot, to lead. Alakai had grown up in a culture where your gender didn't prevent you from commanding armies or governing territories. She was there to avenge her husband, and she took that responsibility seriously. Sources from the time describe her as coldly efficient. She didn't give fiery speeches or make dramatic gestures. She simply gave orders, and those orders were followed. When her engineers told her the walls would take 3 weeks to breach, she said, "Make it 2." When her generals suggested offering terms of surrender, she reportedly said there would be no terms. There would only be death. Can you imagine what must have been going through her mind? Was she grieving? Was she angry? Did she hesitate at all, knowing she was about to order the deaths of tens of thousands of people who had nothing to do with shooting that arrow? We'll never know. History doesn't record her inner thoughts. it only records what she did. And what she did was oversee one of the most methodical destructions of a city the medieval world had ever seen. The siege began on the 7th of April, 1221. At first, Nishapor's defenders probably felt a surge of confidence. After all, they'd fought off Mongols before. They knew how to defend their city. They had food, water, weapons, and high walls. The governor organized the defense with skill. Soldiers were assigned to every section of the wall. Citizens were put to work making arrows and preparing oil to pour on attackers. Religious leaders led prayers for deliverance. Everyone had a role to play. For the first few days, things went relatively well. The Mongols probed the defenses, testing for weak points, and the defenders threw them back. Arrows flew from both sides. Stones from catapults smashed into walls and siege engines alike. Men died on both sides, but the walls held. Inside the city, people started to feel that familiar hope. Maybe they could do this. Maybe they could hold out until the Mongols gave up or help arrived from other cities. But that hope was about to be crushed in the most horrible way possible. Because the Mongols weren't really trying to take the city yet. They were setting up, positioning their equipment, bringing up their siege towers and catapults. And, most importantly, they were completely surrounding the city. See, here's something the defenders didn't fully understand at first. The Mongols weren't going to let anyone escape. They were building a ring of death around Nishapur. Every gate, every possible exit was watched day and night. Anyone who tried to flee was caught and killed, usually in sight of the walls to discourage others from trying. This wasn't a siege where you could send out messengers to beg for help. This wasn't a siege where civilians could evacuate. This was a trap, and everyone inside Nishapur was caught in it. About a week into the siege, everything changed. The Mongols had finished their preparations. Now, they attacked with an intensity that shocked the defenders. This wasn't probing or testing anymore. This was total war. Catapults launched stones at the walls continuously, day and night. The sound must have been incredible, deafening. Boom, crash, boom, crash, over and over and over. The walls, which had seemed so strong, began to crack and crumble under the constant bombardment. Siege towers rolled forward, filled with Mongol warriors ready to leap onto the walls. The defenders set fire to some of them, but there were always more. Always more. And then there were the prisoners. Thousands of them were driven forward, forced to fill in Nishapur's defensive moats with dirt and rubble. The defenders on the walls had to watch these poor people, many of them fellow Persians, being used as human shields. If they shot at the Mongol soldiers driving the prisoners forward, they'd hit the prisoners. If they didn't shoot, the moats would be filled, and the Mongols would have an easier path to the walls. It was an impossible choice, and it broke something in the defenders' spirits. The governor tried to keep morale up. He moved from section to section of the wall, encouraging his men, helping wherever he could. But you could see it in people's faces, the growing realization that they weren't going to win this. At night, people in Nishapur could hear the Mongol camps, drums beating in rhythm, horns blowing, the sound of thousands of soldiers preparing for the next day's assault. It was psychological warfare, making sure no one in the city could rest, could feel safe even for a moment. Sleep became impossible. Fear became the only constant. 12 days into the siege, a section of Nishapur's western wall collapsed. Years of standing strong against earthquakes, weather, and previous attackers meant nothing against the focused, relentless Mongol assault. The catapults had done their work. A section about 50 feet wide just crumbled. The defenders rushed to fill the gap, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with your hands. Mongol warriors poured through the breach. The fighting in that gap was absolutely savage. Men fought with swords, spears, daggers, even their bare hands. Bodies piled up so high that soldiers had to climb over the dead to reach their enemies. The governor himself fought in that breach, trying to inspire his men by example. And for a few hours, they held. They actually pushed the Mongols back, retook the gap, and started building emergency barricades. But everyone knew it was only temporary. If the Mongols could bring down one section of wall, they could bring down others. And they did. Over the next 2 days, 3 more sections collapsed. The defenders were now fighting on multiple fronts, rushing from breach to breach, exhausted and desperate. Men who'd been defending the walls for nearly 2 weeks without real sleep or rest were being asked to fight hand-to-hand combat against fresh Mongol warriors. It was unsustainable. Everyone knew it. But what choice did they have? Surrender wasn't an option. The Mongols had made it clear there would be no mercy, no prisoners, no survivors. The only question was how long Nishapur could delay the inevitable. On April 10, just 3 days after the siege began, the Mongols breached the inner defenses. 3 days. That's all it took to break a city that had stood for nearly 2,000 years. The fighting moved into Nishapur's streets, and that's when things got truly horrific. Because once the Mongols were inside the walls, there was no organized defense anymore. It became chaos. Every street corner, every house, every shop became a battlefield. Soldiers tried to hold key positions. Citizens fought with whatever they could find: kitchen knives, farming tools, stones. Old men stood side by side with teenage boys, knowing they were going to die, but determined to take some Mongols with them. The governor made his last stand at the central mosque, the heart of the city. He and his remaining soldiers barricaded themselves inside, surrounded by citizens seeking shelter. They held out for several hours, but eventually, the Mongols broke through. What happened next varies, depending on which historical source you read. But they all agree on the broad strokes. The governor was captured alive. He was brought before Alakai, the Mongol princess, and she gave an order that tells you everything about what was about to happen to Nishapur. She ordered him to watch what would happen to his city, to see the consequences of resistance. Only after he'd witnessed the complete destruction of everything he tried to protect would he be allowed to die. That's not just cruelty. That's calculated psychological warfare meant to be told and retold across Asia. A warning to any other governor, any other city that might think about resisting. By the evening of April 10, Nishapur had fallen. But the killing had barely begun. Alakai gave orders that would echo through history. Every person in the city was to be gathered. Every single one. And then they were to be executed. Not in battle, not in the heat of combat. This was to be systematic, organized, complete. The Mongols went house to house, pulling people out into the streets. They checked every building, every cellar, every hiding place. If you were alive and in Nishapur, they found you. Families were torn from their homes. Scholars were dragged from libraries. Merchants were pulled from their shops. The sick were carried from their beds. The elderly were forced into the streets. Children were taken from their mothers' arms. And they were all marched to gathering points throughout the city. Can you imagine the sounds? Thousands of people crying, begging, praying. The screams of children separated from their parents. The pleading of old people who couldn't understand what was happening. The prayers of holy men reciting verses from the Quran one last time. The Mongols remained coldly efficient. This wasn't personal for most of them. It was just orders. Sort people into groups, keep them under control, wait for the final command. That night, as the sun set over Nishapur, the city that had been full of life, learning, and beauty just days before was now a prison holding its entire population hostage to their fate. The governor, forced to watch from his chains, must have known what was coming. He'd heard the stories. Every city in Persia had heard the stories of what Mongols did to places that resisted. But knowing something intellectually and watching it happen are two very different things. As darkness fell on the 10th of April, 1221, the last night of Nishapur was filled with the sounds of thousands of people who knew they were about to die and could do nothing to stop it. Tomorrow would bring horrors that historians still struggle to fully describe. Tomorrow would see the systematic execution of an entire city's population. Tomorrow would prove that the Mongols didn't make idle threats. But tonight, for a few more hours, the people of Nishapur were still alive, still hoping for a miracle that wouldn't come, still praying for mercy from an army that had none to give. The jewel of Persia was about to be crushed to dust. I need to warn you right now, this chapter is going to be hard to read. What happened in Nishapur over the next few days represents one of the darkest moments in human history. But we can't look away from it. We can't pretend it didn't happen, because the only thing worse than remembering atrocities is forgetting them. So let's talk about what happened when the sun rose on the 11th of April 1221. Dawn broke over Nishapur, and with it came a silence that must have been absolutely eerie. Gone were the sounds of battle. Gone were the catapults and the shouting and the clash of steel on steel. Instead, there was just the sound of thousands of Mongol soldiers taking their positions around groups of terrified people. The entire population of Nishapur had been divided into manageable groups and held in different parts of the city. Historians estimate there were somewhere between 170,000 and 200,000 people in Nishapur at the time of the siege. That's roughly the population of a modern mid-sized city. Families, workers, soldiers, children, elderly, an entire living, breathing community. Alakai's orders were simple and brutal. Kill them all. But here's where it gets even worse. This wasn't going to be done quickly. This wasn't going to be soldiers cutting down armed enemies in the heat of battle. This was going to be execution. Systematic, organized, deliberate execution. The Mongols divided up the work. Different units were assigned different groups of prisoners. And then, with the cold efficiency that characterized everything they did, they began. I'm going to be honest with you. The historical sources from this period don't give us every detail. And maybe that's a mercy. But they give us enough to understand what happened. The Mongols used beheading as their primary method of execution. Why? Because it was fast, efficient, and the heads could be counted to ensure the orders were fully carried out. Remember, Alakai wanted proof that every single person had been killed. You can't fake a skull count. Groups of prisoners were brought forward. Some sources say they were made to kneel. Others suggest they were forced to lie down. Mongol soldiers moved down the lines with swords and axes, working methodically. Try to imagine the sounds, the screams, the prayers, parents trying to shield their children, people begging for mercy that wouldn't come, the awful, rhythmic sound of blades falling, over and over and over. And here's something that makes it even more horrifying. This took days. You can't kill 170,000 people in an hour, or even a day, no matter how organized you are. This was a process that stretched across multiple days, which means people in the back of the lines had to wait, knowing exactly what was coming, watching their fellow citizens die, hour after hour, day after day. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the psychological torture of waiting your turn to die, watching the line in front of you get shorter and shorter, knowing there's no escape, no hope, no mercy? Some people tried to run. They were cut down or captured and brought back. Some begged to be allowed to convert to the Mongol religion or swear loyalty to the Khan. The answer was always the same: no. Nishapur had been sentenced to death, and that sentence would be carried out in full. Young men, old women, teenagers, children, babies. The Mongols made no distinctions. Everyone died. And then, after the killing was done, came something that still makes historians' blood run cold. Alakai gave an order to sort the bodies. The heads were to be separated and organized into 3 distinct groups: men, women, and children. And then from each group, a pyramid was to be built. 3 pyramids of human skulls, arranged neatly as a monument to what happens when you resist the Mongol Empire. Think about the mindset behind that order. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't chaos. This was deliberate, calculated, and meant to send a message. The pyramids served multiple purposes. They were a monument to Tokchar, the fallen son-in-law, a warning to other cities about the cost of resistance, a demonstration of Mongol thoroughness and power, proof that the orders had been fully carried out, Teams of Mongol soldiers spent days organizing these skulls, building the pyramids carefully so they wouldn't collapse, making sure each one was substantial enough to be seen from a distance. Imagine being a Mongol soldier given that assignment. Your job isn't to fight. Your job is to sort through thousands of human heads and stack them into neat piles. What does that do to a person? How do you go home after that and live a normal life? Historical accounts describe these pyramids as being quite large. Some sources claim each one was taller than a mounted horseman. Whether that's precisely accurate or not, the point is clear. These weren't small memorial cairns. These were massive monuments to death. The Pyramid of Men's Skulls was the largest. The Pyramid of Women's Skulls was substantial. And then there was the smallest pyramid, the one made from children's heads. I'm sorry. I know that's an awful image, but that's what happened. And we need to bear witness to it even centuries later, because these were real people. Real children who had dreams and played games and loved their parents and had their whole lives ahead of them. They deserve better than to be forgotten. But wait, there's more. And somehow, this detail makes it all feel even more surreal and horrible. The Mongols didn't stop with humans. Alakai's orders included all living things in Nishapur: dogs, cats, horses, donkeys, chickens, pigeons. Every animal in the city was hunted down and killed. Why? To make the silence complete, to ensure that no sound of life remained in Nishapur, so that travelers approaching the ruins would hear nothing. No barking, no bird song, no neighing of horses, just silence. The silence of complete and total death. Some sources claim that even plants were uprooted, though that seems like it might be an exaggeration. But the animals? That's confirmed by multiple historical accounts. The Mongols went through the city killing every living thing they could find. It's such a bizarre detail that it almost doesn't seem real, but it tells you everything about the Mongol approach to warfare. When they decided to make an example of a city, they didn't do it halfway. They were thorough to a degree that's almost incomprehensible. Remember the governor? The man who'd been forced to watch all of this? His end came after the pyramids were complete. According to the sources, he was brought before the 3 skull pyramids. He was made to look at them, to understand that every single one of those skulls represented someone he'd failed to protect, someone who trusted him to keep them safe, someone who died because of his decision to resist. Some accounts say he broke down completely at that point, that he begged for death. Others say he remained defiant to the end, cursing the Mongols and promising that history would remember them as monsters. Either way, his death came shortly after. Some sources say he was beheaded like everyone else. Others claim he was executed in a more elaborate way, befitting his rank. The details vary, but the outcome was the same. The last leader of Nishapur died looking at the monument of skulls built from his people. While all this killing was happening, other Mongol units were systematically destroying the city itself. And this is another tragedy that often gets overshadowed by the massacre of people. Remember, Nishapur wasn't just a city, it was a center of learning. Its libraries held thousands of manuscripts, books on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, poetry, philosophy, history. Many of these texts were unique, the only copies in existence. The Mongols burned them all, not because they hated knowledge. The Mongols actually respected learning and would later become great patrons of science and art. But in this moment, in this city, their orders were to destroy everything. So ancient manuscripts that had survived for centuries went up in flames. Imagine being a scholar and watching your life's work burn, seeing irreplaceable texts turn to ash, knowing that knowledge that took generations to accumulate was being wiped out in hours. The observatory where some of the greatest astronomers of the age had tracked the stars, demolished. The medical school where physicians had learned to treat diseases, destroyed. The poetry gardens where some of the most beautiful verses in the Persian language had been composed, torn down. It wasn't enough to kill the people of Nishapur. The Mongols wanted to kill the very memory and culture of the city. After it was all over, Alakai wanted a final count. She needed to report back to her father that the job was complete, that vengeance for her husband had been taken, that not a single person had been spared. The Mongols had a system for this. It's darkly efficient and absolutely chilling. According to historical sources, the task of counting was given to one of Alakai's officers. This man spent days verifying the death count, walking through the city, checking the pyramids, making sure every house was empty, every hiding place had been searched. The number he reported back has been preserved in several medieval chronicles. 174,000 people. Some modern historians think this number might be inflated. Medieval chroniclers were known to exaggerate numbers. Maybe it was only 100,000, maybe it was 150,000. But does it really matter if the exact number was 100,000 or 174,000? Either way, an entire city died. Every man, woman, and child. That's not just a statistic. That's 100,000 individual tragedies. 100,000 people who woke up one day with plans and hopes and dreams and never got to see another sunrise. Think about your own city or town. Now imagine every single person you know gone. Every house empty. Every street silent. That's what happened in Nishapur. When the Mongol army finally left Nishapur, they left behind a scene of utter desolation. The city was in ruins. Buildings had been deliberately demolished. Walls had been torn down. The irrigation systems that had brought water to the gardens were destroyed. Fires had blackened entire neighborhoods. And in the center of it all, 3 pyramids of skulls stood as monuments to what had happened here. Travelers who passed by Nishapur in the weeks and months after the massacre reported a smell that could be detected from miles away. The smell of tens of thousands of decomposing bodies. The smell of death on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Some also reported something else. The absolute silence. No human voices, no animal sounds, no bird song, just the wind blowing through empty ruins and the rustle of windblown debris. One Persian chronicler who visited the ruins months later wrote something that I think captures the horror perfectly. He said that Nishapur had become a plain where you could not tell that a city had once stood. The Mongols had done what they set out to do. They'd erased Nishapur. Not just defeated it, not just conquered it, erased it. Number. The message received. News of what happened at Nishapur spread across Asia like wildfire, and it had exactly the effect the Mongols intended. Cities that had been considering resistance immediately surrendered. Governors who'd been planning to fight opened their gates without a single arrow being fired. Kings and sultans sent messengers to Genghis Khan, offering tribute and submission. The massacre at Nishapur saved Mongol lives. That's the cold, brutal calculus of their strategy. By being utterly merciless to one city, they convinced dozens of others to surrender without a fight. From a purely military perspective, it was effective. But the cost? The cost was 174,000 human lives. The cost was the destruction of centuries of accumulated knowledge. The cost was a scar on human history that still hasn't healed. And here's what really gets me. It worked so well that the Mongols never had to do anything quite this extreme again. Other cities learned the lesson. When the Mongols said surrender or die, people chose to surrender. Nishapur died so that other cities could live. That's its terrible legacy. So why don't more people know about Nishapur? Why, when we talk about historical atrocities, does this one often get skipped over? Part of it is geography. Nishapur was in Persia, far from Europe, where much of our historical narrative is centered. Western history classes focus on events closer to home. Part of it is time. This happened 800 years ago. That's a long time. The immediate emotional impact has faded. It's just words in history books now. And part of it, I think, is that it's just too much. The scale of it is so overwhelming that our minds struggle to process it. 174,000 people, 3 pyramids of skulls, an entire city erased. It's easier to focus on smaller, more comprehensible tragedies than to grapple with something this massive. But here's why we need to remember. Because those people deserve to be remembered. Every single one of them. They weren't just numbers. They were people with names and faces and families and hopes. They were the merchant who was saving money to expand his shop. The mother who just had her first baby. The old man teaching his grandson to read. The teenage girl writing poetry in the garden. The scholar working on a mathematical proof. the baker making bread for his neighbors. They all died in one of the most systematic massacres in human history. And the least we can do, centuries later, is remember that they existed, that they mattered, that what happened to them was wrong. Nishapur fell. But its story doesn't have to be forgotten. So Nishapur was gone, wiped off the map. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, in some ways, that's where the really interesting part begins. Because what happened next tells us a lot about human nature, about power, and about how societies react to unthinkable horror. Let's talk about what the world did when it learned that an entire city had been murdered. In 1221, there was no Twitter, no CNN, no way to instantly broadcast news around the world. But don't think for a second that meant information traveled slowly. Bad news has always had wings. Mongol messengers were the first to carry the story, of course. They rode to other cities in the region with a very specific message. This is what happens when you resist. Surrender now, or Nishapur is your future. But there were other messengers too. Merchants who'd been outside the city when it fell. Scouts from nearby towns who'd watched from a distance. Refugees who'd escaped before the siege began. They all spread the word, and with each retelling, the horror grew. Here's the thing about medieval communication. Stories got embellished. Numbers got bigger. Details got added. But in the case of Nishapur, the truth was already so terrible that exaggeration was barely necessary. When you tell someone that an entire city's population was beheaded and their skulls stacked into pyramids, what do you even add to make that worse? Within weeks, everyone in Persia knew. Within months, the story had reached as far as Egypt, India, and China. Within a year, even distant Europe had heard whispers of the terrible fate of Nishapur. And the world's reaction? It was complicated. The most immediate effect was exactly what the Mongols wanted: mass surrenders. City after city in Persia threw open their gates when Mongol armies approached. Governors who'd been preparing to fight suddenly decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Kings and princes sent expensive gifts and messages of submission to Genghis Khan. The city of Herat, which had initially resisted the Mongols, heard about Nishapur and immediately sent messengers begging for mercy. They offered tribute, hostages, anything the Mongols wanted. The Mongols accepted their surrender and left the city relatively intact. Balkh, once called the mother of cities, surrendered without a fight. So did Merv, another great Persian city. So did dozens of smaller towns and fortresses. Think about what that means. Nishapur's destruction saved thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives in other cities. Those people got to live because Nishapur's people died. That's the brutal math of terror as a military strategy. But here's what's messed up. This created a weird kind of survivor's guilt across Persia. Cities that surrendered were spared, but they had to live with the knowledge that they'd submitted to the people who'd committed one of the worst massacres in history. They'd bent the knee to monsters. What does that do to a society's pride, to its sense of honor? Persian culture valued bravery, resistance against tyrants, standing up for your beliefs. But now, the lesson everyone learned was surrender or die. Resistance is not heroic, it's suicide. The Mongols had fundamentally changed the psychology of an entire region. Now, you'd think that religious leaders across the Islamic world would have united in condemnation of what happened at Nishapur, right? That they'd call for a holy war against the Mongols, that they'd rally the faithful to resist these invaders. Some did. Some brave imams and scholars did preach resistance and called the Mongols a test from God that Muslims needed to face with courage. But they were in the minority. Most religious leaders took a very different approach. They started teaching that the Mongols were a punishment from God, that Muslims had strayed from the true path, become corrupt and sinful, and God had sent the Mongols as divine retribution. There are chronicles from this period where Islamic scholars literally argued that submitting to the Mongols was God's will, that resistance was futile because God had decided to punish the Muslim world for its sins. Now, before we judge them too harshly, put yourself in their shoes. You're a religious leader. Your job is to give your community hope, to help them make sense of senseless tragedy, to provide spiritual comfort. What do you say when an unstoppable force has just killed 174,000 people in a neighboring city? You can say, God will protect us if we fight, but Nishapur fought and God didn't protect them. You can say, this is unjust, but justice doesn't seem to be winning. So instead, you reframe it. You turn the Mongols into instruments of divine will. It's not comforting, exactly, but it makes the horror feel like it has meaning, like it's part of some larger plan. This theological response had real consequences. It made resistance seem not just dangerous, but actually sacrilegious. If the Mongols were God's punishment, then fighting them was fighting God's will. The Mongols, ironically, didn't care about any of this. They weren't particularly religious themselves, and they didn't force people to convert. They just wanted submission and tribute. But this theological reframing made their job easier. Medieval chroniclers couldn't stop writing about Nishapur. It became the go-to example whenever anyone wanted to illustrate Mongol brutality. Persian historians like Juvayni, who lived just a generation after the massacre, documented it in detail. He interviewed survivors from surrounding areas, collected accounts, tried to piece together what happened. His descriptions are clinical and detailed and absolutely heartbreaking. Arab historians picked up the story. The famous chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing from Iraq, included Nishapur in his massive history of the world. He called it one of the greatest calamities ever to befall the Islamic world. Chinese sources mention it too. The Mongols kept records, and Chinese officials who later served the Mongol Empire had access to these documents. They confirmed the basic facts. The city was destroyed, the population killed, the pyramids built. But here's what's interesting. Different chroniclers emphasize different aspects of the story depending on their agenda. Persian writers focused on the cultural loss, the destruction of libraries and learning. They mourned Nishapur as a jewel of Persian civilization that could never be replaced. Arab writers emphasized the religious angle, the loss of Muslim lives, the destruction of mosques. They fit Nishapur into a larger narrative of Islam under assault. Chinese sources were more matter-of-fact about it. They noted it as an example of effective Mongol military strategy, almost analytical in their approach. European chroniclers, hearing the story third or fourth hand, often exaggerated the numbers even more and added fantastical details. They portrayed the Mongols as almost demonic, inhuman monsters from the East. Everyone used Nishapur's story for their own purposes. But at least they all agreed on one thing. Something truly terrible had happened there. Okay, let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed much, but is actually pretty important. What do you do with 174,000 bodies? The Mongols had built their skull pyramids and moved on. They weren't going to stick around to deal with the decomposing corpses. But someone had to, right? According to various accounts, people from surrounding villages and towns were eventually forced to deal with the aftermath. Teams of workers, probably wearing cloth over their faces against the smell, came to Nishapur to try to make the area less of a health hazard. The bodies that weren't already in the skull, pyramids, had to be buried or burned. This took months. Can you imagine that job? Day after day, dealing with decomposed remains, knowing that each one was a person who'd had a name and a life. Some sources say the skull pyramids were eventually toppled and the skulls buried in mass graves. Others suggest they stood for years, slowly weathering and falling apart. Either way, the logistics of dealing with that many dead bodies in a medieval society was a nightmare. There was also the question of property. Nishapur had been a wealthy city. Gold, jewelry, goods, property deeds, all of it was left behind. Who owned it now? The Mongols took a lot of it as plunder, but there was too much for them to carry away. So the surrounding region experienced a bizarre and morbid gold rush as people came to scavenge through the ruins. Imagine being one of those scavengers, walking through empty houses, taking things that belong to dead people, stepping over bloodstains, trying not to think about what happened here. Some of those scavengers probably found things that made them break down crying. A child's toy, a love letter, a half-finished meal left on a table. The physical cleanup of Nishapur took years. The psychological cleanup? That never really happened. Here's something that surprised me when I researched this. People tried to rebuild Nishapur. Not immediately. Of course. The area was toxic, literally and figuratively, for years after the massacre. But humans are remarkably resilient and persistent. Within a few decades, people started drifting back to the site. Why? Well, partly because Nishapur's location was still strategically valuable. It sat on major trade routes. There was water. The land was fertile. Just because a terrible thing happened somewhere doesn't mean the geographical advantages disappear. Small settlements started to pop up near the ruins of old Nishapur. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, hoping to catch some of the trade that used to flow through the city. These weren't grand attempts at reconstruction. These were people trying to make a living. But the new settlements never grew to anything approaching the old city's size or importance. It's like the land itself was cursed. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Who wants to build their home on the site of a mass grave? There's actually a city called Nishapur in Iran today. It's a decent-sized place with a few 100,000 people. But it's not quite in the same location as the original city, and it's definitely not the same city. The Nishapur that was a jewel of Persian civilization died in 1221 and never came back. The modern city is like a ghost wearing the old city's name, a reminder of what was lost. Now let's talk about something that makes people uncomfortable. How did the Mongols themselves view what they'd done? We have to be careful here because most of our sources come from the conquered peoples, not the Mongols themselves. But from what we can piece together, the Mongols saw Nishapur as a successful military operation. They'd eliminated a threat, sent a message to other cities, and avenged the death of one of their own. Mission accomplished. There's no evidence that Genghis Khan or Alakai lost any sleep over it. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake from their perspective. It was strategic, cold, calculated, and effective. The Mongols believed that one overwhelming act of violence could prevent the need for many smaller acts of violence. Kill one city completely, and 10 others surrender without a fight. In their worldview, that was actually the merciful choice. Later, Mongol rulers would actually become quite sophisticated and cosmopolitan. They'd sponsor art and science, protect trade routes, practice religious tolerance. The Mongol Empire, at its height, was, in many ways, quite progressive for its time. But that doesn't erase what happened at Nishapur. And here's the thing. The Mongols never apologized for it, never expressed regret, never tried to hide it. They were actually pretty open about it because, from their perspective, Nishapur got what it deserved for resisting. That's chilling, right? The complete absence of guilt or shame about killing an entire city. But it makes sense if you understand their worldview. To them, Nishapur's fate was a logical consequence of a bad decision. Choose to resist, face the consequences. Simple as that. P, the Nishapur massacre didn't just affect that one city or that one region. It rippled through Persian culture for generations. Persian poetry from after the Mongol conquest has a noticeably darker tone. There's more emphasis on the impermanence of life, the fragility of civilization, the senselessness of pride. Some scholars argue that the trauma of the Mongol invasions, with Nishapur as the prime example, fundamentally changed Persian literature and art. The massacre also created a weird cultural phenomenon. Nishapur became a byword for total destruction. For centuries after, if someone wanted to threaten complete annihilation, they'd say, "I'll make this place another Nishapur." It became metaphorical shorthand for the worst thing that could happen to a city. In political discussions, leaders would reference Nishapur as a cautionary tale. "Do you want to end up like Nishapur?" was a way of saying, don't fight battles you can't win. It was used to justify appeasement, surrender, and accommodation with powerful enemies. This had real policy implications. When later empires threatened Persia, the Timurids, the Ottomans, even European colonial powers centuries later, Persian leaders would sometimes reference the Mongol invasions and Nishapur specifically as justification for diplomatic rather than military solutions. The massacre became woven into the cultural DNA of the region, a shared trauma that shaped how people thought about power, resistance, and survival. Wait, you're thinking, survivors? Didn't everyone die? Well, not everyone was in Nishapur when it fell. There were merchants who'd left on business trips, scholars who traveled to other cities, soldiers who'd been stationed elsewhere, children who'd been sent away before the siege began. These people had to live with the knowledge that their entire families, their entire communities, everyone they'd ever known was gone. That's a specific kind of trauma that's hard to even comprehend. Some of these survivors left written accounts or were interviewed by later historians. Their stories are fragmentary and heartbreaking. They talk about the guilt of surviving, about nightmares that never stopped, about the impossibility of explaining to people who weren't there what it felt like to lose everything. One account I came across was from a merchant who'd left Nishapur 3 days before the Mongols arrived. He spent the rest of his life convinced that if he'd stayed, maybe he could have saved someone, his wife, his children, anyone. He became a wandering beggar, unable to settle anywhere, unable to start over, haunted by survivor's guilt. Another account was from a young scholar who'd been studying in Baghdad when Nishapur fell. He received news that his entire family was dead via a letter from a friend who'd heard it from a traveler. He never returned to Persia. He spent the rest of his life in Baghdad, teaching and writing, but colleagues said he never smiled again, never married, never formed close attachments to anyone. The massacre had broken something in him that couldn't be fixed. These were the lucky ones, the survivors, and their lives were defined by loss. Here's the question that historians still debate. Could anything have prevented the Nishapur massacre? If the governor had surrendered immediately when the first Mongol army arrived, would the city have been spared? Probably yes. We have examples of Persian cities that surrendered and were largely left intact. If Nishapur hadn't killed Tokchar, would the revenge have been less severe? Maybe. But the Mongols were already pretty brutal to cities that resisted, even without personal motivation. If other Persian cities had united to help defend Nishapur, could they have won? Unlikely. The Mongol military was simply superior at that point in history. More unified forces than Persia's had tried to stop them and failed. The hard truth is that Nishapur was probably doomed from the moment they decided to resist. Not because resistance is always wrong, but because they were facing an enemy that was too strong, too organized, and too committed to making examples of resistant cities. But here's the thing. Hindsight is 20/20. The governor of Nishapur didn't know for certain what would happen. He was making the best decision he could with the information he had. He was trying to protect his city, maintain its independence, defend its honor. He made a choice that resulted in catastrophe, but it wasn't a crazy or irrational choice given what he knew at the time. And that's the tragedy of it. This wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made by specific people in specific circumstances. History turned on those choices, and 174,000 people paid the price. So what do we learn from all this? What's the point of digging up this 800-year-old tragedy and examining it in detail? I think there are a few lessons here that are still relevant today. First, the effectiveness of terror as a strategy. The Mongols proved that extreme violence against one target can achieve political goals more efficiently than moderate violence against many targets. That's a deeply uncomfortable truth, but it is truth. And we see echoes of this strategy throughout history, right up to the present day. Second, the danger of pride and misjudgment. Nishapur's leaders overestimated their ability to resist and underestimated their enemy. That's a mistake leaders and nations continue to make. Sometimes surrender really is the smart choice, even if it feels cowardly. Third, the importance of remembering. What happened at Nishapur was an atrocity. If we forget it, if we let it fade into obscurity, we dishonor the victims and we lose important historical lessons about human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. And fourth, the complexity of historical judgment. The Mongols were brutal, yes, but they also built the largest contiguous land empire in history, facilitated trade and communication across Asia, and in many places brought stability and prosperity. History isn't simple. Monsters can build. Builders can commit atrocities. Reality is complicated. The aftermath of Nishapur shows us all of this. It shows us how the world responds to horror, how cultures process trauma, how power shapes history, and how memory works over time. Nishapur fell in 1221, but in a sense, it never stopped falling. It keeps falling every time someone forgets what happened there. every time we choose convenient lies over uncomfortable truths, every time we look away from historical atrocities because they're too painful to examine. So we remember, we bear witness, we tell the story, because that's all we can do for those 174,000 souls now. We can make sure they're not forgotten. So here we are. We've walked through the entire horrific story of Nishapur, from its golden age as a jewel of Persian civilization, through the siege, the massacre, the skull pyramids, and the aftermath. Now comes the big question. Why does this matter? Why should anyone in 2025 care about something that happened 800 years ago in a city most people have never heard of? Let me tell you why. Because Nishapur's story isn't just about the past. It's about patterns that keep repeating throughout human history. It's about choices we still face today. And it's about remembering what humans are capable of, both terrible and remarkable. The pattern that keeps repeating. Let's start with something uncomfortable. The basic strategy the Mongols used at Nishapur didn't die with them. It's been used over and over throughout history, right up to the present day. The formula is simple. Inflict overwhelming violence on one target to terrify others into submission. Make the cost of resistance so high that surrender seems like the only rational choice. Turn one city, one village, one community into an example that everyone else will remember. We saw it when the Romans destroyed Carthage and salted the earth. We saw it when various empires used collective punishment to control rebellious populations. We saw it in World War II with strategic bombing campaigns designed not just to destroy military targets, but to break civilian morale. We see it in modern conflicts, where terrorist groups or authoritarian regimes commit atrocities specifically to be remembered and feared. I'm not saying all these situations are exactly the same as Nishapur. Context matters. Motivations differ. But the basic logic is similar. One spectacular act of violence can achieve what 1,000 smaller acts cannot. And here's the really disturbing part. It often works. Not always, but often enough that people keep trying it. The Mongols proved that making an example of Nishapur led to mass surrenders across Persia. That success has inspired imitators for 8 centuries. Understanding Nishapur helps us recognize this pattern when we see it today. It helps us understand the cold logic behind certain atrocities. And maybe, just maybe, it helps us think about how to break the pattern. The question of resistance. Nishapur's story also forces us to grapple with a difficult question that's still relevant. When should you resist, and when should you surrender? The governor of Nishapur chose to fight. In his cultural context, with his value system, it might have seemed like the honorable choice. Defend your city, protect your people, stand up to tyrants. These are values we still celebrate today, right? We make movies about heroic last stands. We honor soldiers who fight against impossible odds. But his choice got everyone killed. Every man, woman, and child in the city paid for his decision with their lives. So was he brave or foolish? Honorable or reckless? It's easy for us to judge from our comfortable distance in time. We know how it turned out. But put yourself in his position. You don't know for certain what the Mongols will do. You have responsibilities to your people. You have your own sense of honor and duty. What do you choose? This isn't just a historical question. Leaders today face similar dilemmas all the time. When does a country negotiate with terrorists or authoritarian regimes? And when does it stand firm? When do you compromise your values for survival? And when do you fight for principles, even if it means risking destruction? There's no easy answer. But Nishapur shows us the stakes. It shows us that sometimes the heroic choice and the wise choice aren't the same thing. And that the people who pay for leaders' decisions are often not the leaders themselves. The destruction of knowledge. Remember those libraries that burned? Those manuscripts that turned to ash? Let's talk about what that means. Nishapur was a center of learning. Scholars there had made advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. They'd written books and poetry. They'd accumulated knowledge over centuries. And it all vanished in a few days of deliberate destruction. We can never know exactly what was lost. That's the nature of destruction. Once it's gone, it's gone. But historians estimate that hundreds, maybe thousands of unique manuscripts disappeared when Nishapur fell. Mathematical proofs, medical treatises, historical records, poetry, philosophical arguments. Some of that knowledge was eventually recreated elsewhere. Some of it was preserved in other libraries, but some of it, gone forever, lost to humanity. And this keeps happening. We saw it when ISIS destroyed ancient sites in Syria and Iraq. We see it whenever libraries burn, whether in war or through neglect. We see it in the modern age, when digital archives are lost to hackers or hardware failures. Nishapur reminds us that knowledge is fragile. Civilization is fragile. The accumulated wisdom of generations can disappear in an afternoon. And once it's gone, getting it back is incredibly hard, if not impossible. There's a reason librarians and archivists and historians get so passionate about preservation. They understand what Nishapur teaches, that every lost book, every destroyed archive, every forgotten piece of knowledge is a small death of human achievement. The psychology of trauma. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The psychological impact of mass atrocity doesn't end when the killing stops. It echoes through generations. The survivors of Nishapur, those who weren't in the city when it fell, carried trauma for the rest of their lives. But more than that, the societies that witnessed what happened from afar were traumatized too. Think about it. If you're living in Persia in 1221 and you hear what happened to Nishapur, how does that change you? You become more cautious, more willing to submit to power, less likely to resist authority. You teach your children to be careful, to avoid drawing attention, to survive rather than to fight. That kind of trauma can shape a culture for generations. Some historians argue that the Mongol invasions fundamentally changed Persian culture, making it more fatalistic, more focused on survival than glory, more willing to bend rather than break. We see similar patterns in other societies that have experienced mass atrocities. The trauma becomes part of the cultural memory. It influences how people think about risk, about authority, about what's possible and what's dangerous. And in the modern world, we're still figuring out how to deal with collective trauma. How do societies heal from genocide, from ethnic cleansing, from mass violence? How do you move forward when everyone carries the weight of historical horror? Nishapur doesn't give us answers, but it shows us that these questions aren't new. Humans have been grappling with the aftermath of atrocity for as long as we've been committing atrocities. The power of forgotten history. Now let's address something that's been lurking in the background of this whole story. Most people have never heard of Nishapur. It's not taught in most history classes. It doesn't have the cultural resonance of other historical events, and that's significant in itself. See, we tend to remember history selectively. We remember events that happened to us, however we define that. Western history classes focus on European events. American students learn about American history. Chinese students learn Chinese history. That's natural and understandable. But it means that atrocities like Nishapur, which happened far from the centers of power that write our history books, get forgotten. They become footnotes, if they're mentioned at all. This matters because forgetting atrocities makes them easier to repeat. If we don't know the patterns of history, we can't recognize them when they're happening in our own time. If we don't understand how terror tactics work, we're more vulnerable to them. There's also something morally important about remembering. Those 174,000 people who died at Nishapur deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics, not as abstract historical data, but as human beings who lived and suffered and died. Forgetting them is a second death, an erasure that compounds the original atrocity. So in a weird way, you reading this, learning about Nishapur, is a political act. It's saying that these lives mattered, that their story deserves to be told, that we won't let convenience or geographic distance or the passage of time erase what happened. Memory is resistance against the forces that want us to forget. What modern archaeology reveals, here's something cool. Modern archaeologists have actually excavated the site of medieval Nishapur. And what they've found confirms much of what the historical sources tell us, while also adding new details. They found evidence of the massive destruction, layers of ash and debris that show systematic burning, buildings that were deliberately demolished, the infrastructure of the city destroyed not just by siege warfare, but by intentional post-conquest destruction. They've also found mass graves. Not the neat skull pyramids, those were apparently dismantled or collapsed over time, but burial sites where bodies were hastily interred, probably by cleanup crews in the months after the massacre. And they found something that breaks my heart. Everyday objects from ordinary lives. Pottery, jewelry, tools, children's toys. These artifacts are poignant because they represent the normal life that was happening right up until it suddenly wasn't. One archaeologist I read about described finding a house that had been abandoned in obvious haste. Food was still on the table. A child's doll was dropped on the floor. The family had run, probably hearing the Mongols had breached the walls, leaving everything behind in their panic. They didn't make it. Modern archaeology doesn't just confirm that the massacre happened. It makes it real in a way that written sources can't quite manage. When you can hold a cup that someone drank from the morning before they died, history stops being abstract. It becomes viscerally, heartbreakingly real. The bigger picture, the Mongol Empire's dual legacy. Okay, we need to zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture of the Mongol Empire. Because here's where things get really complicated. Yes, the Mongols committed terrible atrocities. Nishapur is just one example among many. Cities across Asia and Eastern Europe experienced similar fates. The death toll from Mongol conquests is estimated in the millions. Some regions lost a significant portion of their population. But, and this is a big but, the Mongol Empire also facilitated unprecedented exchange between East and West. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol protection. Ideas, technologies, and goods flowed more freely than ever before. Paper, gunpowder, printing, all spread westward thanks to Mongol-controlled trade routes. The Mongols practiced religious tolerance in ways that were revolutionary for their time. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, all coexisted in the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan's legal code protected religious freedom and outlawed discrimination based on faith. They brought stability to vast regions. The Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, made travel safer across Asia than it had been in centuries. Merchants could journey from Beijing to Baghdad without fear of bandits or arbitrary taxes. So what do we do with this? How do we square the builders with the destroyers? The tolerant rulers with the mass murderers? I think the answer is we accept complexity. We reject the idea that historical figures or empires have to be simply good or simply evil. The Mongols did terrible things and also created conditions for remarkable cultural exchange. Both things are true. Understanding Nishapur doesn't require us to condemn everything about the Mongol Empire. It requires us to acknowledge the full truth that great civilizations can commit great atrocities. That progress and horror can coexist. That history is messy and complicated and full of contradictions. Lessons for today's world. So what does Nishapur teach us that's relevant right now in our modern world? First, be skeptical of overwhelming force. The Mongols proved that you can achieve short-term goals through extreme violence, but the long-term costs are enormous. Fear-based control eventually breeds resentment, resistance, and instability. Modern authoritarian regimes that use terror to maintain power should study what happened to the Mongol Empire. It eventually fractured and fell apart. Second, protect knowledge and culture. In an age where information seems infinite, we forget how easily it can be lost. Libraries close due to budget cuts. Archives are neglected. Digital data can disappear with a server crash. We need to actively work to preserve human knowledge and cultural heritage, because Nishapur shows us how much can be lost. Third, remember that choices have consequences. The governor of Nishapur made a choice based on pride, honor, and misjudgment. Modern leaders make similar choices. When we elect leaders or support policies, we need to think about the real-world consequences, not just the theoretical principles. Fourth, don't forget inconvenient history. It's easy to remember atrocities committed by our enemies and forget those committed by empires we admire or ancestors we honor. Real historical understanding requires us to face uncomfortable truths about all civilizations, including our own. And fifth, never underestimate human resilience. Despite everything that happened, Persian culture survived. New cities were built, knowledge was recreated, life went on. Humanity has an incredible capacity to rebuild after even the worst disasters. Why I wrote this? Let me get personal for a minute. When I started researching Nishapur, I expected a simple story of medieval warfare. What I found was something much more profound, a mirror reflecting human nature at its worst and its most resilient. The story of Nishapur is horrifying. I'm not going to lie, writing some of these chapters was emotionally difficult. Imagining the fear, the pain, the senselessness of it all. Thinking about the children, the families, the ordinary people just trying to live their lives who got caught in the machinery of empire. But I also found it important, necessary even. Because if we don't know about Nishapur, we don't fully understand human history. We don't grasp the patterns that keep repeating. We don't appreciate how fragile civilization really is. And we don't honor the memory of those 174,000 people who died for nothing more than being in the wrong place when power decided to make an example. Every single one of them deserves to be remembered. The merchant and the scholar, the mother and the child, the soldier and the poet, the governor who made a fatal choice and the citizens who paid for it. They were real, they lived, they mattered, and now you know their story. The responsibility of memory. So what do we do with this knowledge? What's the point of knowing about Nishapur now that you've read all 5 chapters? I think we have a responsibility, not a legal one, but a moral one. The responsibility to remember, to tell the story, to make sure that these people don't slip completely into oblivion. You can't change what happened in 1221. You can't save anyone, but you can bear witness. You can say, this happened, this was real, these people existed. And when you see echoes of Nishapur in the modern world, when you see powerful entities making examples of the weak, when you see knowledge being destroyed, when you see terror being used as a tool of control, you can recognize it, you can name it, you can resist it. That's the power of historical knowledge. It's not just trivia. It's not just interesting stories from the past. It's a lens for understanding the present and a tool for building a better future.
The Mongols wanted Nishapur to be a warning, a message written in blood and bones that said, this is what happens to those who resist us. And it worked for a while. But 8 centuries later, we can take that same story and give it a different meaning. We can make it a warning of a different kind. This is what humans are capable of when power becomes absolute. This is what happens when we forget that every life has value. This is why we must remember. The final word. So here we are at the end. The most terrifying Mongol massacre you've never heard of. Except now you have heard of it. Now you know. Nishapur was once a city of gardens and libraries, of poets and mathematicians, of families and merchants and ordinary people living ordinary lives. For a few terrible days in April 1221, it became a monument to the worst of human nature. And then it became something else, a forgotten tragedy, a footnote in history books, a name that most people don't recognize. But it doesn't have to stay that way. Every person who learns this story, who shares it, who remembers those 174,000 souls, keeps their memory alive. In a small way, we undo the erasure that the Mongols tried to accomplish. The skull pyramids are long gone. The ruins have been buried by time. The exact location of the old city is disputed even by archaeologists. But the story survives. And as long as it survives, so does some small part of Nishapur. I don't expect this story to become as famous as other historical events. But maybe, just maybe, the next time someone talks about the Mongol Empire, someone else will say, "Yeah, and did you know about Nishapur?" Maybe history teachers will include it in their lessons. Maybe other writers will tell the story in different ways. Maybe the ripples of memory will spread just a little bit farther. Because at the end of the day, that's all any of us can hope for, right? To be remembered. To have our lives matter. To leave some mark on the world that says, I was here. I existed. I mattered. The people of Nishapur got that stolen from them. The Mongols tried to erase them so completely that it would be as if they'd never existed at all. But they failed. Because you just read their story. Because now you'll remember them. Because somewhere in your mind, those 174,000 people will live on. At least a little bit. And maybe that's not much, but it's something. It's better than oblivion. So remember Nishapur. Remember the city of gardens and poetry. Remember the moment when pride met power and ordinary people paid the price. Remember the skull pyramids and the silence that followed. Remember the survivors and the trauma that echoed through generations. Remember that it happened. Remember that it was real. Remember that they mattered. Because if we forget, if we let these stories slip away into the darkness of time, then the erasure is complete. Then the Mongols really did win. Then those people died for absolutely nothing. But as long as we remember, as long as we tell the story, as long as we bear witness to what happened in that spring of 1221, the Nishapur still exists, not as buildings or walls or gardens, but as memory, as warning, as lesson, as testament to both the worst and best of what humans can be. The city fell, but its story endures. And now, that story is yours to carry forward. The end. In memory of the approximately 174,000 souls who died at Nishapur in April 1221. May they not be forgotten. A final note to readers. Thank you for staying with this story through all 5 chapters. I know it was heavy. I know parts of it were hard to read. But I believe these are exactly the kinds of stories we need to know. If you found this meaningful, share it. Talk about it. Keep the memory alive. That's how we honor the dead and learn from history. And remember, the patterns of the past don't have to be the patterns of the future. We can learn. We can do better. We can build a world where cities like Nishapur never fall again. That's the real legacy. That's the true memorial. Not just remembering what was lost, but working to prevent future losses. The story of Nishapur is over, but our responsibility to it continues.